In the autumn of 2022, people walking the Mississippi banks near Memphis found themselves on ground that hadn't seen the sun in living memory. The water retreated so far it exposed a Civil War-era ship, revealing intact buckles, cartridge boxes, and bullets untouched since the 1860s. The river fell so far below its normal channel that massive sandbars, some the size of city blocks, rose up into the open air. This wasn't a one-time anomaly. In October of 2022, water levels plummeted past all-time historic lows. Then, in 2023, the river broke those same records again, hitting a new low for the second year in a row. For the first time in recorded history, the mightiest river in North America didn't just have a dry season. It began to behave in ways that were once considered unimaginable. The drop in water immediately crippled the region's economy. With the channel too shallow to navigate, agricultural and industrial barge traffic came to a halt, stranding vessels and freezing the movement of Midwestern crops right at the height of harvest season. But the lack of current created a more direct threat to human life. Without a strong flow of fresh water to push it back, saltwater from the Gulf of Mexico crept 60 miles upstream, contaminating the drinking water supplies for local communities. The situation became so desperate, the Army Corps of Engineers had to barge in fresh water by the boatload to keep local taps safe. A lack of rain was the immediate trigger for the crisis, but the reason the water levels dropped so low has everything to do with the engineering decisions made over the last century, decisions meant to make the river safer, that ended up making it more vulnerable. Before the 20th century, the Mississippi was not a straight, predictable channel. It moved in wide, lazy loops called meanders, constantly shifting, cutting new paths, and abandoning old ones to leave behind crescent-shaped lakes. Despite its volatility, this waterway was the circulatory system of the American economy. Steamboats navigated these winding bends to move hundreds of millions of pounds of cotton from plantations to the coast. But the wild river was lethal. Submerged tree trunks, known as snags, were driven deep into the riverbed by the current. They could tear a boat's hull open with no warning, sinking ships and claiming lives in minutes. As towns along the banks grew and the economic stakes increased, the river's natural behavior became an unacceptable liability. To protect commerce and lives, the river had to be tamed. The first major attempt to control the waterway began in the late 1800s with the construction of levees. These were massive embankments designed to wall the water inside a permanent channel. The hydraulic theory was simple. By containing the river, the force of a flood would push itself out to sea more quickly. But a river that can't spread its energy sideways into floodplains is forced to go faster and rise higher, hitting everything downstream with much more power. This strategy failed catastrophically in 1927. Unprecedented rainfall caused the levees to burst, releasing a wall of water double the volume of Niagara Falls and leaving over 27,000 square miles of land submerged for months. The 1927 disaster demonstrated that trying to control the river through levees alone was a flawed strategy, but the solution that followed would change the river's physics forever. After the flood, the Army Corps of Engineers received a new mandate. They had to find a way to flush floodwaters to the Gulf of Mexico as fast as possible. The logic was geometric. A river that meanders through wide loops travels a longer distance and loses energy to friction at every bend. If engineers could cut a straight line across the neck of those loops, the water would move much faster. Between 1933 and 1942, workers dug 16 artificial cutoffs. They effectively erased notoriously complex meander systems, trading miles of winding curves for straightaways. This redesign was so radical that the lower Mississippi between Memphis and Baton Rouge was reduced from 680 miles to just 510. 170 miles of the river simply vanished. This redesign worked as a drain, flushing floodwaters to the sea, but the engineers didn't account for what happens to a high-speed chute when the rainfall stops. Shortening the river steepened its gradient. This created a faster, more erosive current that began scouring its own bed, cutting downward into the channel floor and destabilizing the very banks the engineers were trying to protect. The environmental cost was devastating. This armored, high-speed channel reduced the river's natural sediment delivery to 40% of its normal volume. Starved of the mud it needed to rebuild, the Louisiana coast began to steadily disappear into the Gulf. By concentrating all of the water's energy inside a narrow, rigid channel, the river now paradoxically produces higher flood stages for the same volume of water than it did a century ago. We traded a dynamic, living ecosystem for a rigid industrial pipe. It became incredibly efficient at moving water out, but it had lost its natural ability to hold any of it in. This trade-off is exactly why the droughts of 2022 and 2023 were so severe. Before the levees, wild floodplains acted like a massive sponge. They soaked up excess water during floods and then slowly released that stored moisture back into the channel during dry seasons. By walling off the levees and cutting away the meanders, we physically severed the river from its natural sponge. We eliminated the backup system that sustained the river when the rain stopped falling. The Mississippi didn't reach these record lows by accident. We built a machine with no backup reserves, successfully managing the floods, but leaving us stranded in the mud when the rains fail.